But it's very important. We're studying through the prophets in the 2 o'clock Wednesday class, and we were talking about Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi today, and we talked about how there's a shift in time from studying Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel from a pre-exilic and a very, very beginning of the exile and fast forwarding all the way to the temple reconstruction is a jump in time, but a lot of big historical things happened in that time period. You have some things that people know about, like the Battle of Marathon happened in there, the beginning of the Persian Empire. A lot of things that happen in that neck of the woods as far as timing. And I think it's good for people to tie historical events that are familiar to them from their secular studies, if you will, to biblical times, because it makes it not be, I told them today, like some Lord of the Rings fairy tale. It makes it real. You're not reading Beowulf, you're not reading Canterbury Tales, you're reading something that's real and it happened within the broad history of the world. And so we've kind of worked through most of that today, so far in this lesson. What we will begin to talk about are some concepts and things that are important to your understanding and interpretation of the New Testament that were present in Jesus' time and do affect our reading of the Bible. Now, there's Bible readers and there are Bible students. If you're in here, I hope you are a Bible student, because this is not a Bible reading class. This is a class where I want to help you and help myself as I study for these lessons be a better interpreter of the Bible. It is a bait into false teaching when we think we can read the Bible with 21st century eyes, Western 21st century eyes, and properly interpret the Bible. And we'll talk about some of those things tonight. And so reviewing a little bit, last week we did talk about Judaism during Jesus' time, some things that get talked about often. If you remember, we talked about, and if you didn't remember, you can go back and look at last week's study online, the concept of monotheism, things that were unique that separated the Jews from the surrounding Gentile world, Sabbath observance, dietary laws, Messianism. We talked about there's no Messiah for the Greeks and the Romans. They don't need a Messiah. They already have a Lord and Savior sitting on the throne in Rome. We talked about the example of Cornelius and Peter going into his house and how unacceptable that was for Jews to do it, even Cornelius recognizing that Peter coming in the house. We didn't talk about this last week, and we didn't get a chance to, but table fellowship is a very important concept to the ancients, because who you had table fellowship with meant that you accepted them. If I go over to the seller's house and I sit and have dinner with them, I hadn't been invited to do that, by the way. But if I go over and have dinner with them, that means that we're on the same page. I accept them. I wouldn't go to their house if I knew they practiced some sort of debauchery. I'm going to check that out before I go over, if I ever do. But if that's going on, then I'm not going to go there, because I'm not going to endorse that. And you can think about it not only in how Jesus got judged, how he was judged for who he ate with. I'll tell you, he got killed because of who he ate with tax collectors and sinners. And then we see it over, we have to read it over in Galatians, but when Peter was in Antioch with Paul, he would eat with the Gentiles until the people from Jerusalem came. And all of a sudden he withdrew table fellowship from them. And Paul lets him have it about that. And so that is an important concept to understand, of who you associate with, who you have a meal with, is an endorsement of them. Of course, Jesus was guilty of eating with sinners, and aren't we glad? And you see how much imagery there is in Jesus' description of the afterlife in heaven, of a big messianic banquet, and also where you're seated at tables in his lessons. Very, very important. Everybody had to eat. That's one thing for sure. Don't picture people sitting in chairs either. The Lord's Supper painting is so terrible because they didn't eat it. They did not sit in chairs. That's what happened with medieval people, put their beliefs in that. We had talked about also the walls that we throw up, social, racial, financial, theological, things that we tend to put in place that shouldn't separate us from other people sometimes, and sometimes should separate us from people, especially when it comes to moral and ethical walls that we separate ourselves with. So looking at this strange old world is what I titled this lesson. In many ways, the ancient world, or at least the concepts that existed there, would be familiar to us, and things that we can look at and say, okay, we understand living in that situation. For example, they had an economy. In that economy, we don't see coinage really necessarily in the Old Testament. By the time of the New Testament, a shekel is a unit of weight, not a coin. We have to keep that in mind. But people could have possessions and wealth and money. Mostly it would probably be gold and silver pieces or chunks. But we have government-issued coinage, stamped things, probably somewhat regular in its size and weight that you might be familiar with. Now, our coins keep getting lighter and lighter, right? Because the metals in them are worth more than the value of the coin. I mean, you can't, a penny-sized piece of copper is worth more than a penny. And so you don't get that anymore. And so they do have certain alloys, and we think about all the way from the 2 little cheap pieces of copper that the widow threw in, all the way up through a day's pay, which would be like a denarius coin. Major amount of trade. Most likely Paul traveled on a trade ship, maybe a barley or grain ship from Egypt, and caught that, or some kind of trade vessel when he was being brought back from or taken to Rome as a prisoner in the book of Acts. We don't know that for sure, but they threw the cargo overboard. Well, you don't have cargo on a ship. It's not, it does not carry cargo. Also, we have a concept of debt. Now, one of the things I do here that's a mistake is to think about that the average person in Jesus' world could go into debt like we can go into debt. Buy a car, buy a house, run up credit cards. That's probably not the case. The concept of them going into debt is probably, I'm going to sell myself into debt slavery because I need to feed my family. It's for the basic subsistence level stuff. It wasn't that everybody was eyeing a nice chariot down at the chariot dealership and saying, I want to buy one of those. They simply didn't have that. We think somewhere between 80 and 90% of people lived at the subsistence level. There's no middle class. And so debt would be a terribly crushing thing like it can be today, but not nearly like we might think about it in the same way as commonplace as it might be today. Obviously, morality issues. There was sexual sin was very prevalent. If I had to name one sin, it gets talked about more in the New Testament than anything else, I would say sexual sin is in there. But also sins that are equally as heinous before God: greed, envy, jealousy, gossip, are equally placed on those sin lists that we see Paul, for example, sometimes give in his letter. There's no difference between adultery and homosexual sex and envy. Although we have decided that there is, I will tell you, envy and jealousy will destroy a church as fast as anything else in existence. So that stuff existed. We also did have, we'll talk about this not this week but next, that there is a class structure. Not nearly as many rungs on that ladder as we are accustomed to here. We have like 18 different classes of middle class. You know, we have lower middle class, lower upper middle class, middle class, you know, all these things. You really had poor people, and then you had senatorial, equestrian classes. That they did have a common language or common languages. Mostly in the western part of the Roman world, you would speak Latin, and in the eastern part, we would have Greek, mainly left over from Alexander the Great's Hellenization of that world when he conquered most of what we would call the known world, all the way from India to Greece in the beginning of the 4th century BCE. And so they did have a common language. We're pretty accustomed to a common language within our country. And English is becoming sort of the lingua franca of the business world, taking over from such things as French. Religion existed, and a wide variety of religion. Also certain associations, maybe akin to some of our modern day social clubs, like the Kiwanis Club or the Lions Club, or even those who had religious affiliations like Masons. And there are also cults. Now, cult is a really negative word in our culture. We think about like Waco or Jim Jones or something really far out, but they would have cults meaning something dedicated, for example, to the goddess Isis of Egypt would be a very popular cult. So a lot of religious cult. Religion was really an integral part of these people's lives. More so than many people within the Christian umbrella, where Christianity is something that we place on a shelf and we break it out on Sunday morning, maybe Sunday night, and maybe Wednesday night. But for the most part, it's not a daily thing in some people's lives. I hope that it is. Most of the people come on Wednesday night, by the way, it is. And so that's why you're here. But keep in mind, there'll be 250 adults in Bible class tonight. On Sunday morning, we have about 550 adults in Bible class. And so there is a difference between those things. But religion was part of these people's lives, and it's why Christianity was so offensive. Christians were accused of being atheists. because they no longer went to the temple. They didn't believe in the gods. Therefore, that was an economic issue, and that was a very, very painful religious issue for many average Romans in the world, because they're like, wait a minute, we're going to reduce the number of people who go to the temple. That's going to make the gods angry, and it's not going to rain, and our crops aren't going to grow, and all these things. They were legitimately angry at Christians. Sometimes I think it's almost treated like racism against Christians in the early days of Christianity, but it's really not. It was really people legitimately worried about these strange and weird people doing these things. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We are accustomed to pervasive government. And so we think about, we have a federal level government, we have a state level government, you have a county level government. Those of you that choose to live within the boundaries of a city also have municipal level government. And so the Roman government was pervasive. They were in charge, and it's a good thing. When the Western Roman Empire fell, Europe and descended into the Dark Ages, they had a very stable judicial system. Probably about as stable as what we have now. And they had courts and they had orders of law. We see that in how Paul is treated. Because he is a Roman citizen, he is afforded certain judicial procedures, even able to appeal to the court of Caesar in Rome and be taken at government expense to that. Okay, that's the same thing here. We bus criminals to and from jail for their courts. It's the same thing. So they have a very stable, orderly judicial system, and also these organized political subdivisions and territories. Pontius Pilate, for example, was over a province, but he served under the Syrian governor, who had a much larger area to govern. And so you had to subdivide these things up just to be organized. And take care of these people. So a lot of those things we're familiar with, right? We can relate to that. And in many ways, a lot of American government system and our judicial system and things follow a great deal of patterns that we learn from the Romans. However, there are some very, very unfamiliar areas. And these are the areas that we have to be encouraged to explore. And as we study a passage or book, we have to understand this, and we're going to talk tonight primarily about Greco-Roman slavery because it is a pervasive topic both in reality and in metaphor in the New Testament. And we have an entire letter to Philemon to deal with, where Paul is dealing with, how is he going to react to his runaway slave Onesimus, because Onesimus was Philemon's property. There's no bones about it. He was his property. And so we'll talk a little bit about that and why sometimes people are nervous to talk about that today. We'll cover some of that. Very unfamiliar. Hopefully that's unfamiliar territory, at least in government-endorsed slavery today. One of the biggest things that we don't understand, and it's why we don't understand Eastern cultures today throughout the Middle East or the Asian subcontinent or China or Japan, is we don't understand what an honor-shame culture is. We do not live in an honor-shame culture to the extent that the ancients did, where it was really an integral part of our lives. We may do things that bring honor upon ourselves or may make us ashamed, but it's not the components of it are not the same. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in another night because we'll treat that pretty fairly. Also, we need to understand patron-client relationships. Now, I don't ever like to, I get in trouble probably for endorsing a rated R movie in the church, but I'm not endorsing this movie. But if you want to understand what a patron-client relationship is, you watch The Godfather. Because what you have is, in the Mediterranean world, you have an individual who has wealth and power and influence, and he will help you and you will owe him your loyalty. Because there is no police department, there's not a banking system in place. When you need money, you may have to go borrow it from that person. I think about the centurion that we talked about. He built a synagogue in his community that would bring great honor upon him and also great loyalty from the Jewish citizenry there, that they would owe that to him. And thinking about, we kind of take about people and we respect them more for their money more than we do for their honor. And we think about people being a patron to people. We're like, well, a patron is somebody that goes into a convenience store, right? We think about a patronage as something we do. But a patron, and then having clients, people that owed you something that you may have to call on them to do a service for you one day. Or if there is an election or something along those lines, they will support you in doing that because you have given them the proverbial turkeys on Thanksgiving. And so we have to think about that relationship. That exists in metaphor and in reality. We have to be thankful. In early Christianity, there were many people who were patrons of the church because they let them meet in their house. There are not very many people who owned houses large enough for a church to meet in. This room right here is about 8,000 square feet. It's about 80 by 100 in here. I could probably fit 20 of their houses in this room. When we think about what size a little just one-room house with maybe a roof on it. So patrons like Lydia, Phoebe, other people who let people meet in their house, it's very important. We'll talk about slavery here a little bit more, also about social class and status, which is very important. We'll talk about that also within family relationships. It's very important for us to know how that structure was, and also understand that all of these structures varied between Palestine, Greece, Asia, Rome. Depending on where you live, I often hear people talk about things in biblical studies as if it was uniformly the same across the entire Roman world. And that's not how it was. Things would be very different in rural Galilee than they may be in downtown Rome. Okay, we can't think about, and Jews and their thinking even would be very, very different in that time. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll spend an entire week in this lesson series on family structure and gender roles. Anytime the New Testament tells me something and talks about something more than twice, I call it pervasive. Okay, because it doesn't talk about singing that more than 2 times in the New Testament, and we hang our hat all over it. But Paul and Peter both give sets of what's called household codes. I might even say as many as 4 times about husbands, wives, masters, slaves, children, those things, and how they were ranked and how that works. Marriage in Jesus' time was nothing like marriage today. Parenting, I can tell you, was nothing like my method of parenting, where Presley was on an ivory tower in my household and the number one priority, and still the biggest investment we have ever made in our lives financially. Okay, I'm going to tell you, still going. It's still accruing. And now we're talking about grad school. So it still continued to accrue as the largest investment of my life. And so, but I can assure you that is not how children were viewed when 50% of them weren't going to make it past their 10th birthday. Okay, so we have to think about that a little bit different. We'll talk about gender roles. We'll talk about community versus individualism. We are in the latter, right? I don't care what happens to David Burker's road, but I want my road paved. I don't care how much you have to pay in taxes to bolster me or anybody. I talk about me. I'm going to get all I can all I get, and sit on the can. That's what I said. That's what we care about as Americans. That is not what exists in an honor-shame culture. Community trumps individualism. It's why Paul says, put the sinful man out in 1 Corinthians 5, that he may be shamed into coming back to you. It would have been very shameful to lose your community to come back. Here today, we wouldn't do that for nothing because we're scared that somebody might post on Facebook that we put a sinner out of the church, okay? We don't want to work, or they'll just go down the street to the next church. And so we do live in a very different society. And tonight we will, after we talk about slavery, talk about something that sounds very strange, but we'll talk about limited resources environment or limited resources dynamics. That sounds very strange, but I'll explain it. It's going to make a whole lot of sense, and it's only going to take one slide to do that. An area of great study for me has been in the Greco-Roman slave system. And so we need to understand that many of you, if you'll read the preface to your Bibles, if you have a translation that's probably made since the 1990s, like the ESV or others, they'll have a section generally in the front of the preface of the Bible is how they're going to treat the Hebrew word ebed and the Greek word doulos. They will say, hey, we have chosen to render this word servant or bondservant. In certain cases, and in some cases, we have rendered it as slave, because obviously there is a desire to be sensitive about that issue, and I think that is great. I think that it is, because it is the most disgusting institution in the history of this country that we enslaved people because of the color of their skin and did not regard them as human beings, even in a legal way. in government legality, we didn't regard them as human beings. That's a disgusting embarrassment in our history. And if anybody thinks otherwise, they can't be a member of the Lord's church and think that somebody is not human and can be owned as property. But we say, well, why didn't Paul abolish slavery? We're going to talk about that tonight. But there are many things similar to the Greco-Roman slave system and 18th and 19th century North American and Caribbean slave systems, and they're listed on the board there. There are also some stark raving differences that any southern plantation owner would say no way to. But definitely the same. They were property. They were owned as property, no different than anything. Even back in the Old Testament. Now I'm fixing to make a lot of women mad, and I'm just kind of half joking around. But if you look at the 10th commandment, a wife is listed right there amongst all the rest of a man's property. You know, and so I'm just kidding. I get in trouble for that, but it's really true that's the case. In many ways, women were viewed in that society as more like property than a person. But we think about a person's property as something they own. It could be bought, they could be sold, they could be also abused. Now, supposedly, my understanding is that in many places in the Roman Empire, it was illegal to kill a slave. Now, whether or not that was enforced strongly or not is another thing. It's one thing if I am in the suburbs of Rome versus I'm in the fields of Galatia somewhere and my slave just happens to die. You know, but one of the problems is you are killing a very important piece of the economic system. And so it's not just about humanity. They did have a human sense to it as well, but they were abused and could be mistreated, and you would not get in the same trouble as if you mistreated another citizen. They were also involved in piracy and trade and illegal things. People were stolen. Slaves were like any other piece of property. They could be stolen, and much like the 18th, 19th century United States, there was a great deal of philosophical debate about whether or not slavery was moral and ethical. And that had been going on ever since the Greeks had slaves. One of the reasons that people look down on the Spartans, for example, the people that are about Green Beret and Navy SEAL to the 10th power that lived in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, they enslaved fellow Greeks. All able-bodied males were in the military. And so all the other work had to be done by called helots or slaves. But other Greeks in Athens looked down at them like, why would you enslave your fellow Greeks? Can you not go get barbarians? And other people and make slaves out of them for war and those purposes that we have. Acquisition of slaves was a little bit different as well. But we think about illegally buying and selling slaves, hijacking ships with slaves on them. They were a valuable piece of the economy. One of the other things that was similar is not everybody owned a slave. Just like for some reason, sometimes in the modern day United States, every Southerner owned a slave. No, because you couldn't afford to keep them up and feed them. It was really, the truth of the matter is most of the time, slaves were actually taking jobs away from Southerners that could have worked in the fields and got paid to do it and willing to go kill themselves to uphold an institution that was putting them out of a job. But we think about these people being treated very differently than other people around them. We'll talk in a minute how important it is. Here's what's different. It did not matter what color your skin was. If we were walking down the street, you couldn't tell if somebody was a slave just by the color of their skin. There would be no suspect of that. People were acquired by slaves, by war. A lot of people sold themselves into slavery. You're really not going to like this, but a lot of parents sold their children into slavery to pay off debts or to increase their child's social status. Because it didn't matter that you were a slave, it mattered whose slave you were. And so you guys, how many of you guys remember the old Ben-Hur movie with Charlton Heston? Look, see, some of y'all will show your age. I can't ask this question on Sunday morning because none of my class that I teach will watch this movie, and they're missing out. But if you remember, Ben-Hur was a prominent Jew, right? Judah Ben-Hur was his name. Judah, son of Hur, was his name. He was a prominent Jew, got in trouble, was kind of betrayed by his best friends, and what was he thrown into? Slavery, right? And after he saved the Roman senator's son, what happened? The Roman senator adopted him. What happened? He came out a higher social status than he went in. Now he had all, because when he goes back to Jerusalem, he is respected and can command certain things to be done, and he is of higher rank than the people that put him into slavery. So it's not meant to be that in the movie, but that is what he was adopted as a slave, and he came out at a higher social status, at an equestrian or senatorial class. But these people could be white, they could be African, they could be whatever. It didn't make any difference. They could be traded into slavery. Sometimes, a lot of times, they were the captives of war. Sometimes they were criminals. If you're a criminal, you get put in slavery, you get put in the Roman mines where you have a life expectancy of about 2 weeks. But other people were slaves that maybe even sold themselves in. They could also often be freed, or they were also paid what is called in Latin a pecunium, which means they may get a certain amount of money and be able to save that money up and buy their freedom. Do you think that existed in the southern United States? Absolutely not. You were a slave until you ran away or died. And so, and freeing slaves, at one time people say, Octavian, I think, had to say, stop freeing your slaves. There's too many of them. There's too many freed slaves. Because you have people that can be freed slaves that may be a higher social status that people were born free, but born poor. And so he's like, hey, there's a little bit too much of that freeing slaves going on. You could voluntarily put it yourself into slavery. One of the most interesting things that you find is responsibilities. And we kind of run into this a little bit. It would not be unheard of. Bob, for a minute, you're going to be kind of a wealthy slave owner. It's okay. But you might have someone of your slaves run your market for you or your business, almost like your manager for you. And education would have been beneficial. Now, that is not something that was encouraged in North American slavery. To even be able to read or write was withheld from slaves. But for us to put somebody in charge of a business or to be a guide and a protector for our children, we'll talk about that here in a minute out of the book of Galatians, that is terribly translated schoolmaster in some English translations. You can have slaves to do all kinds of things that may require an education, may require some business sense, some accounting sense. They may be in control of other slaves. They may manage them as well. And so a lot different. And it was not a political football. It was not an issue that the Roman Empire was going to, that half the Roman Empire was going to secede from the Union or secede from the Union over slavery. And I'll tell you why. Because you know how important that is to the American economy? And not just for what goes in your vehicles to go up and down the road, but every piece of plastic that you own, tons of other things, the little things that power your house, those little green things in some of y'all's front yards that provide electricity to your house as a transformer, they're cooled with oil. There's all kinds of things that petroleum products are used for. Imagine removing that from the American economy instantaneously. What happens? Utter economic collapse, right? We'd be throwing stones at each other by the time it gets done and stealing from each other to survive. That's how important Greco-Roman slavery was to the Roman slave economy. It was absolutely necessary from their economic point of view. And so when you wonder, why does Paul not cry out? Maybe Paul wanted to. He does write to Philemon and say, hey, won't you take it easy on Onesimus? Because I know what you want to do. You want to beat his brains out for running away from you. And I understand that, but I want you to treat him as a brother now, a little bit something different. But Paul's not going to go around screaming for the abolition of slavery in the Roman Empire because Christianity be snuffed out instantaneously. Like, whoa, now we've had about enough of y'all's religion, but that's me like going around preaching that we ought not put gasoline and diesel in our cars. You're out of your mind. That's how important it was. Millions of people were in slavery in the Greco-Roman. So you're like, why is that such a frequent metaphor in the Bible? It's because it was all in their face. And it existed in human society for a long time and thinking about this. So let's think about some examples. It's hard to understand some of Paul's conversation with Philemon if you don't understand anything about slaves. And thinking through that, our thinking would be like, well, he'd be okay with Onesimus. He wouldn't punish Onesimus, really? What about the other slaves that Philemon owns? And they say, oh, it's okay to run away from Philemon. There's not going to be any recompense for that. We could just run away and we'll just go find Paul and we'll become Christians and he has to just forgive us. There's a real challenge to Philemon. Paul pushes him in a corner. And Paul even offers to repay what Onesimus may owe to Philemon, because there's probably a loss of revenue for Philemon, or maybe he's had to pay somebody to do the job Onesimus did. This is a big deal. To us, it's very strange and foreign, and it should be strange and foreign to us. But Philemon's property was Onesimus. And we really don't want to think about that. But it has a very good religious connotation to us that we'll talk about kind of last here. It also served as boundaries, in 1 Corinthians and Galatians 3 and Colossians 3. There's no longer Jew nor Greek nor slave nor free. It is a boundary that existed. Paul addresses that, like we'll talk about in his so-called household codes that we look at. It was a boundary marker as much as Jew and Greek was, or Jew and a Greek and a barbarian. Along those used to be very distinct walls of separation. And Paul says, as far as it's spiritually concerned, those don't exist anymore. And that's a big thing we talked about last week between Jew and between Greek. So we have to understand that a little bit to understand these things. And I'm not telling you got to be an expert in Greco-Roman slavery. I'm just saying when you encounter that in your studies, understand this is something that I'm not familiar with and I need to dig a little deeper into it. And I'm going to look into these things and think about it. We think about status as a slave, somebody's class that they may be in, of being along and being a slave and belonging to somebody. I'm giving you some passages, y'all. We're not going to look them all up, obviously, tonight. For time's sake, you're welcome to take pictures of that and go and look them up in a later time. So it was a status. We'll talk a little bit about children's status. We have a very famous story, right, of Jesus and the disciples saying, don't let the children bother him. Because Jesus was a rabbi, a teacher, a man of honor and respect, at least among those who followed him. He's not going to be bothered by these children because children rank just above slaves and livestock in the social ladder. And so that's why they don't want Jesus to be bothered by these people who don't even have any business bothering the teacher. He's got more important things to do. John 8:35 is a good example of thinking about being bought or slave or freed as a slave. That's something we will encounter several places. I guess I probably could have put right there in being freed from slavery or being bondage to slavery along those lines. Revelation 18 talks about the slaves as property, right along the side of things as property. A really good lesson to be learned is over in Galatians chapter 3 is the concept of a pedagogue. And that is what is often translated in your translation as a guardian. Paul is metaphorically talking about what was the purpose of Torah, what was the purpose of law over the Jew, that it was a guardian until such time that the gospel came and it came to a sense of fullness. And he metaphorically compared that to a young child who needs a guardian, which was most often an older slave that could no longer work anymore. He wasn't the slave's teacher in the sense that he taught him reading, writing, and arithmetic. He was more of him tutoring on social skills, making sure he got from place to place on his own, obviously only by wealthy people to oversee that. But at some point, that child came out from underneath that guardian's tutelage and became a son. Became an adult, probably at the age of like 12 or 13. He comes on out of underneath that guardian, and that guardian was responsible for him for a period of time to keep him in line. Probably did put a whooping on him every once in a while. Whooping is an ancient Greek word. We put a whooping on him every once in a while. But then there's a point in time where that's not needed anymore because maturity has been reached. And that's Paul's metaphor. And if we don't understand that metaphor, now look, I don't know what a schoolmaster was in the 17th century when the King James was translated. But most of us think about a schoolmaster as a principal, a school principal or a teacher. That is not what a pedagogue was. He may have been even taking the child to his place of education. Keep in mind, most children did not get a K through 12 education in this day and time that we're talking about here. But it had a different role. It's important for us to understand that, or we don't understand the metaphor that's being placed there. And the audience he was writing to would have understood that. They've understood what a pedagogue is and what that purpose is, and that they're temporary. And the law, the old covenant, was temporary until such time as things came to maturity. So there's a big metaphor used right there that we may not fully understand unless we think about it. And then there's the ones that really they like to be sensitive about the wording. It's when we go from being a slave of sin, this is a theological part, to being a slave of Christ. Well, we don't like that terminology. We don't normally stand around and say, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. And we do like to use the word servant. I don't like that softening of the word. And I'll tell you why. Because you are the property of Jesus Christ. You have been purchased by Jesus Christ. And the New Testament speaks of you in such terms. So if I say servant to the modern day American, it sounds like I'm Jesus' butler. Okay? And that maybe I've got some compensated position. To me, and I understand why that is softened. And maybe even bondservant is okay because I owe a debt, and that's why I have to do it. But I am Jesus' property. I was bought with a price. I was the property of sin, and now I'm the property of Jesus Christ. That's how Paul's audience would have understood it. They wouldn't have thought about some nicely dressed guy that answers the door. Now, I'm not saying they weren't slaves that answered the door, okay? But I'm saying that's not what they... So I'm a little bit cautious when translations do that, because to me, it kind of takes away some of the intimacy and the magnitude of what that really meant. Now, Jesus doesn't abuse us, things along those lines, but we belong to Him, and He is our master. Now, we don't mind saying that. We don't mind saying, I'm going to follow the master. I'm going to obey the master. Do you obey Jesus like you would if you were obeying an earthly master as a slave? Probably not. Probably not. I may not have that same fear of that. And Jesus is not going to beat us, but on Judgment Day, if we haven't been faithful, He will send us to hell. And so we need to make sure we understand how serious it is. And I hate to get around cushioning on that. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about tonight in our past few minutes, obviously I've just given you a taste of things. There are some books that I'm going to recommend to you. One of them is The Backgrounds of Early Christianity by, I just lost my mind. He's a member of the church, actually. Everett Ferguson is an excellent, it's in its 3rd edition now. It is an excellent 1-volume thing that you can get for about $15 to $20 on Amazon. It's about 2.5 inches thick. But it covers all these topics, and it's a great resource that's broad in scope, that if you say, hey, I don't understand this passage, it's talking about slavery, I can go and read a little bit, because you're not going to remember everything that I've told you tonight. I've thrown a ton of stuff at you at one time. I encourage you, if you want to be a good Bible student, it can be very, very economically challenging to buy a commentary on every book of the Bible, okay? That's a monumental expense to go through. But there are some times you can buy a book that would be a broad coverage for you, and I recommend books like that. I'll try to throw some up next week on the screen for you to write. Obviously, I'm not endorsing everything that gets said in the book. It's why I would tell you to probably buy 3 or 4 resources and read broadly. One of the best things you can buy is collections of essays. There's a book called The World of the New Testament that is a collection of essays. So what you have in there is an essay written on different topics, from the Romans to history to Judaism to slavery to whatever you want to talk about, women, family, marriage, whatever that is. And it's written by an expert in that topic, and you got it all collected in 1 volume. It's not one person commenting on all those things. It is 2 dozen experts on each of those topics. That's an indispensable resource. When I say limited resources dynamics, you told me and you look at me and you think, I don't even have any idea what that means. And you know what? Neither did I. Until I had to have a whole class on it, actually 2 classes, 1 Old Testament, 1 New Testament in my graduate school work. An entire semester, this will sound very boring when I get done explaining to you this, but an entire semester of limited resource dynamics. And I kind of briefly, we talked about this in the men's class a little bit this past Monday morning. We do not know what it's like to live in a society, for the most part, many people in this room. When I say this, I don't want to mean that I include everybody in the United States, because there's a lot of people in the United States that absolutely understand what limited resources means. We have a conception of endless resources, right? How many of you guys turn the sink on at your house and the water magically flows out of it every time that you do, and we do not treat it as if it's a limited resource, right? You know why? Because you live near a river. You live near a river. Now, I was in Las Vegas not too long ago, about a week and a half ago, unexpectedly with Jay as he was going through his little adventure. As you fly over the desert, for those of you who have gone out west, if not for Hoover Dam, Las Vegas doesn't exist, Los Angeles can't exist, and the water supply of most of the West Coast is dwindling down as Lake Mead gets lower and lower. It is a limited resource when it doesn't rain north of the Colorado River and all the things around it. So people who understand those do understand limited resources. We don't even understand that in possessions. I gave this example. Rick, I'm going to pick on you today. Rick drives let's just say pretend for a minute. I may be pretending, I may not be. Rick drives a Rolls Royce. He does not, he says. Well, I want a Rolls Royce. So I'm going to go to the Rolls Royce dealership and buy one. By the way, I can't do that either. Before you start going to the elders and say you're paying them too much, I can't buy a 1985 Rolls Royce with 10 million miles on it. It's not that I want his Rolls Royce. I can go buy another Rolls Royce because there's an unlimited supply. They're making them all the time. In the biblical world, I have to want his because it's the only one that there is. When I want somebody's possessions, when I covet them, it's not that I want to go buy something like they have. I want something that they have. Because we're talking about a world where food and water and basic resources and possessions and land were in very limited supply. So generally I had to want something that somebody else had. And many times that often existed theologically. We don't believe that God has a limit on his bucket of grace, right? Or love or kindness. But for people who don't have a concept of a world of things that are limitless, it does seem that there's only so many spiritual gifts to go around. And so I'm jealous because Mike has the gift of prophecy, right? I'm jealous because there's only so much of that God's going to give out. There's only so much grace that God's going to give out. Only so much of this, that, and yon that God's going to give out. So there's a theological aspect to it. Now, even in modern day church work, our elders will tell you there are limited resources. It's called how much you guys put in the offering plate. We cannot just say, you know what, we're going to build a new 10,000 square foot building tomorrow. Let's sign a contract and let's go get it. There are limited resources in all of your professions. But we don't think about that when it comes to the basic necessities of life. And these people dealt with that. And it's important to keep that in mind and not think like an American where there's always something. Now, we know a little bit about it, right? Remember when we didn't have enough toilet paper? And you were thinking about using both sides? You remember that? You remember how bad that was? You know, anybody who has any loved ones that lived in Flint, Michigan when the water supply was shut off? Picture your life with no running water. Picture your life where your sewer just has to run out in the street in front of your house. You know, that's what these people lived in because we think about, why was a Samaritan woman at the well? Because she had to get enough water to last the whole day. Okay? And the biblical principle there is women ought to go carry the water, right? Just kidding. I'm bringing that on. I'm going to get darts thrown at me. I've already talked about women being property tonight. I'm going to be in trouble when I get home when my wife watches this. We need to understand that these people lived in that kind of world. And it makes us understand the jealousy that existed many times in the church, especially about possessions or about status or about positions, because there was not an unlimited number of those jobs. Remember the people standing in the marketplace waiting on work? Jesus uses that, kind of as a little parable and metaphor. They're waiting on, because there's only so many tasks. But if I don't get a denarius, my family doesn't eat that day. It's not we're going to open up the pantry and there's a bunch of canned goods in there and I'm going to be able to pop those open or I'm going to be going down to the food pantry and get. We don't eat because there's only so much to go around. There's only so much. There's not supermarkets. There's only so. Hey, the Jews are worried about and Christians are worried about eating meat sacrificed to idols. We're like, well, why didn't they just buy the non-organic green ground beef? Right? Why didn't they just buy the more expensive beef because they were sold out of the cheap beef? No, they were worried it's the only meat that was going to be there and the only amount that I could go and eat. I don't ever see pictures of people in the Bible. We never put them as being overweight, right? They could barely eat enough every day to survive. And so as we look at the New Testament, I can't see the clock from back here. Understand that it's a very different world that you're going. A world that's not beyond your understanding, but a world that's going to take a little bit of elbow grease in your Bible studies to accurately understand, or else you're going to risk being a false teacher. We need to understand what the Bible meant before we say what the Bible means, because it wasn't written to you, but it was written for you. And so we have to be sure we go through that. And it does take a little bit of work. You guys have had to work at understanding other ancient documents. You remember when somebody probably made you study the Iliad or the Odyssey or Shakespeare or whatever? It takes a little bit of work to understand those things because you need to understand. You can't understand Shakespeare if you don't understand the politics of the 16th century. Okay, there's things that you have to know, and the same is true for the Bible if you want to dig in and dig a little bit deeper. We'll see you next week. I don't think I've got it. This is what I want you to take a picture of for your thinking next week before they shut me down. upstairs, and we'll expand on this quite a bit. But there are some honor shame cultures that we can learn from today, that many of the same principles that they've been doing for about 4,000 or 5,000 years would maintain for us today. So appreciate everybody being here tonight. I hope you guys have a great rest of your weeks.